Paper scraps are a problem for every crafter, and with every project you make, the problem gets worse and worse. So many scraps. That stash of paper scraps will just keep growing and growing unless you can find some fun and easy projects to make that will use them up. And that's when I came up with an idea. What if I could use up 50 paper scraps in just 5 days by creating simple projects using supplies I have on hand? Projects that you could make too. It's time to pull out your paper scraps and join me on a 5-day quest to use them all up. It's time for a paper scraps stash busting challenge. Let's go. It's inevitable. If you are making papercraft projects, you are going to make a mess. You are probably going to lose your scissors and you are going to get left with paper scraps. They're like weeds in the garden, impossible to get rid of. I was thinking about just that, and that's when the reality of the situation hit me. For every project I create, I get more and more paper scraps. So I decided it was time for a paper scrap busting challenge. I've pulled out 50 different paper scraps from my stash and I plan on using them all. Here are the rules. Rule number 1, a paper scrap is not a scrap unless it's less than 6 inches wide. Rule number 2, the challenge is complete when I've used 50 paper scraps. And did I mention I want to do this in just 5 days? Really? Just 5 days? 5 days. Rule number 3, any paper scrap left on day 5 must go into the recycling, no matter how pretty it is. In this video, I'll share a surprisingly simple idea that works on lots of different papercraft projects. I'm starting here because it's a great way to use up a bunch of scraps all at once. Let's see just how many of these scraps I can use up today. So here's what I'm working with. These are the 50 paper scraps that I'll be creating with over the next 5 days. To make things just a little bit easier on myself, I have pulled out scraps only from my Maggie Holmes collections. That way I know that they're all going to work together quite well. As you can see, I've got pattern paper scraps, ugly paper scraps, white and neutral paper scraps, and even some teeny tiny paper scraps. No scrap left behind. Today's project also starts with a paper scrap. This one though is from my stash and it does not matter what colour it is because it will be covered up as we go along. Think of it as a base or an anchoring point that we can layer our paper scraps on top of. Essentially, we're going to make a patchwork quilt. A paper patchwork quilt, that is. I do want my quilt to coordinate, so I am going to be working with the warm tones in the scraps that I have. I'm using that really lovely mustard yellow tone as a reference. I am also trimming the papers as I go because a lot of the papers I have here are quite large for this idea, so I want to trim them into smaller rectangular shapes. At this stage, I'm thinking a lot about what colours are going to go where. I do want this to look quite random and organic, but I do want the colours to be balanced across this piece of cardstock. Speaking of random and organic, I hope you're noticing the outside edge of the piece of cardstock that I'm working on. Notice that the pieces that I'm placing are not lining up. I've talked about this a lot on the channel, but not in a little while. I want the outside edge of this piece to be interesting. I don't want it to be a perfect rectangle as such with 4 perfectly straight lines. I do want this to appear a little bit more like a patchwork. So I'm not lining up those pieces perfectly. I'm thinking much more about the color mix and the print mix as I place things than I am about the alignment of them. You can see here too that I'm not just placing the pieces one on top of each other. I am actually weaving them and layering them in. So some of the pieces will go on the top layers and some will be woven into more of the bottom layers. I'm loving the look of this, so much so that I'm going to create a card today as well. I'll start with another piece of scrap card, but this one actually is measured to fit my card base. I've found for cards, it's so much easier to know the exact dimensions that you're working with, and they are a little bit different to the scrapbook layout format because you want your edges to be nice and crisp and clean and lined up perfectly. To achieve this, all I've done is trimmed off that excess with my fussy cutting scissors. For this card, I did start with some of the larger pieces first, and once I got that card base covered and looking good, I've then added in some smaller pieces for a little bit of extra detail. Now, you can use these pieces just like this. I, however, wanted to add some extra detail, so I have added in some stitching. It adds beautiful texture and detail, and these are now ready to use on projects. I will start with the scrapbook layout and then move on to the card. Here's a look at the photos that I'm working with, and I'm sure now you can see why I really wanted to draw on those beautiful warm color tones. This photo was taken on my daughter's birthday, and I love the sage green in her top, and then the filter kind of made the wall very creamy, and I just really wanted to run with that color scheme. It's so pretty. So what I've done with our paper scrap quilt that we created is run it as a strip along one side of the layout. Now you could do this horizontally like I have for this layout, or you could do it vertically. I actually imagine spending a lot of time just creating a bunch of these and having them sitting in a dish on my desk ready to go to add to all sorts of projects. I feel like they could be a win-win, something that's really great to do if you were missing your mojo or you weren't really wanting to commit to a full layout, so you could create some of these. But then when it came time to create, you'd have something that was a jumping off point. You wouldn't really be starting from scratch. I'd also love to add these to my junk journals and imagine them in beautiful textured vintage paper. They would be so nice. Now also, any of the sketches that you might have that has a vertical or horizontal panel of pattern paper, you could replace that panel with one of these. Instead of trying to find a large piece of pattern paper for your sketch, why not use a bunch of your paper scraps that coordinate and use this instead? Now we need to talk about layout design, and I am running with the horizontal lines for this one. I do want the eye to be drawn left to right across the page. So I am going to work with a large embellishment cluster in the top left-hand corner, and then balance that out with some embellishments down here in the bottom right-hand corner of that second photo. I am going to run with florals and butterflies because florals and butterflies, and they are actually quite curved in nature, and I do want to be mindful that the layout doesn't end up being too blocky. There are a lot of rectangles in the paper patchwork that we made. I've also added a rectangular journaling spot on the right there, and I'm working with 2 rectangle photos, so I am mindful that I'll need to balance out a little bit of that blockiness and create some smooth and round lines. The round wings of the butterflies and of course the soft petals in the flowers will really help with that. I'm really running with the gold accents on this layout, but I do want to be mindful that they're balanced out across the page. I don't want them all in just one spot. So to help with that, I am going to cut that acetate piece in two, and I'll use those as two separate pieces. I do end up auditioning them in quite a few places because I really want to have a heaviness to the left-hand side of the layout that tapers out as it moves towards the right, and it did take a little bit of work to get that balance right. I was hoping that that large oval pink chipboard piece on the left there would do it. Spoiler alert, it does not stay, but it does stick around for a while. You know what will always work? A bow. I'm all about them bows. While I think about the left-hand side, I will get working on the right-hand side. So I know the camera seems a little bit out there, but what I was trying to do was balance out the green in the leaves of that pattern paper above the second photo. The green there was sort of standing out to me a little bit, and I was trying to balance that colour out a little bit on the layout. What I found though was that the camera kind of made the green stand out more, so it does not stay. Neither does the deer actually, even though he is super cute. What I do like about the camera is that it acts as a bit of a full stop. It's a place for the eye to rest as it moves from left to right. So I did switch it out with a die cut sentiment. This one is in a colour that fits the scheme of things much more closely. It's time to add on the title, and I am going with a gold puffy sticker for that. And can you see I have re-auditioned that green camera? I even tried it with a green bow on the left there in the hope that that might balance things out. But to me, all it did was made the green more obvious, which of course it did because I'm adding more green, but not in a good way. I think I'm just going to have to live with it. Okay, so let's talk clusters. I know that I want to have a visual triangle around my photos, just as I was showing there. But in the end, I wasn't really loving these deep red roses. So I switched them out too. I feel like this layout was such a journey. Do you ever have that happen? I just really wanted to press into that neutral color scheme. So the pink chipboard piece on the left, that's gone. It's now that really lovely muted yellow. I've switched out two of the floral elements for gold and white versions, and it's feeling a lot more balanced. With that finally sorted, it is time to finish out the clusters and call the layout done. Here's a look at the completed layout, and of course I have close-up images to share. I want to show you the paper patchwork quilt that we've made, as well as all the details in those embellishment clusters. Next up, I want to show you how this idea works for a card. So of course, I'm going to start with the card base that I already prepped at the beginning of the video, and I am just going to keep this really simple. I've layered up a couple of simple die cut embellishments, and I'm going to create a cluster for the center of the card. For an extra detail, I'm going to layer in a couple of bows. The gold one here is a puffy sticker, and the cute little pink one, that has been fussy cut out of some pattern paper. For the sentiment, I'm going to work with a simple chipboard piece. This one says, "Thankful for you." I'm going to place that towards the bottom of the cluster because my bows are going to sit here at the top. I do find it best to use a liquid adhesive for puffy stickers, and now I can attach this entire front piece onto my card base. And that is the card complete. How simple was that? At the end of day one, I'm feeling pretty good. There is just one thing that is bothering me, and that is the ugly paper scraps. It's always such a challenge to make them look good, and it's hard not to just want to pop them straight in the recycling. That would be cheating, wouldn't it? Yeah, that would be cheating. I'll have to come up with a clever way to use them up, and I'll tackle that tomorrow. It is day 2 of my paper scrap stash busting challenge, where I'm using up 50 different pattern papers from my stash and saving them from the recycling. Here are the rules. Rule number 1. The paper is not a scrap unless it's less than 6 inches wide. Rule number 2. The challenge is complete when I've used up all 50 paper scraps. And did I mention I need to do it in just 5 days? 5 days. Rule number 3. Any paper scrap left after 5 days must go into the recycling, no matter how pretty it is. I'm saving paper scraps of all kinds: pattern paper scraps, ugly paper scraps, neutral paper scraps, and even teeny tiny scraps. No scrap left behind. It is day 2 of the challenge and I still have quite a few scraps to use, but I'm not going to get distracted by that. Today's focus is on the ugly ones. I do not want to get left with those at the end of the challenge, and I have a clever way to use them. First things first, I've chosen a photo and prepped my background. The next task is to choose my ugly pattern papers. I have a couple here that I am going to find quite tricky to use, including that busy mustard one and this one. This one right here has got some random imagery on it. This one I find quite busy, that pink one, and the green one there. That one is very dark. It's quite a dark color tone that I wouldn't normally use. Did you notice? I didn't just use the ugly pattern papers. I mixed them with prints that I love. I want to talk more about that as we go along here, but first I need to show you my plan. Now, I don't want any of these ugly pattern papers to really stand out. We are actually trying to minimize the prints, and the best way that I know how to do that is to use them in very small sections. So I'm creating a bunch of banner pieces, and those banners are going to run horizontally along the layout. These are all 1 inch wide, and I have left them at different lengths because I want to add them in a way that's very textured and I want visual interest. I don't want the tops of the banners and the bottom of the banners to line up. The plan is to pop my photo somewhere there on the right, and I do want to map that out because some of my paper scraps are actually too short. They're not long enough to be seen on the top and the bottom of the photo, see, like that. So I will have to work out a way to be able to use those. The other thing is I want to use this alphabet, which is very pale pink and green, and I need to be mindful about the pattern paper that's going to go underneath it. If it's a super busy print, it will make the title hard to read, and I don't want that. Okay, so I have a plan. So it is time to attach some of these paper strips, and yes, I'm actually going to stitch them down. It's best to work in sections, so I place a couple of the banner pieces and then I'll take this away and add my stitching, come back, add 2 or 3 more banner pieces, then stitch on those. This is all about building up the layers as you go. And can you see my little trick there? That green banner piece on the left, it was too short to be seen underneath my photo, so I have chopped it in half and stretched it out. No one will ever know that there's a gap under there. Well, you will, but you won't tell anyone, right? It is time to add my title, and I'm doing something a little bit different for this layout. The title is actually going to run vertically. I just felt that for the design of this page, it would be better to keep the flow of the title running in the same direction as those banner pieces. It's time to add some more layers and to build out the left-hand side there. And can you see? I found a spot for that oddly printed pattern paper. This one. I've added a small piece on the right there, and I will balance that out with a piece on the left. The other challenge for this layout is that dark green print, and I do think about switching things out and using the B side of that paper, but I remembered I have a bunch of white paper scraps that I also need to use up, and I thought it might be nice to pair that print with these. I really do need to be strategic about this because at the end of day 5, I do not want to have to pop any paper in the recycling. So I have mapped out the left-hand side now, and those two banners on the left, they are stitched down, and I will just go about auditioning different prints and papers to fill in this gap. But here's where it went pear-shaped. The one time that I stick something down, my photo is indeed attached, I decided I wanted to add some more banner pieces underneath it. It felt too blocky. It felt like there were banners on the left and banners on the right and nothing joining those pieces together. So what I need to do is build out the layers underneath my photo. Initially, I was going to do that just with more of the 1-inch strip banner pieces, and I do add a couple of extras, but I also felt like it needed something a little bit more weighty. So I am going to add in a banner piece that is a little bit wider. I did consider this green piece, but it just felt like it was a little bit too green heavy. The layout ended up being too green for my liking. So I do switch it out. I decided to give that tricky pink scallop print a go, and I actually really liked it. In the end, this print actually ends up looking very muted and very neutral. So I love that for it. I love that I've been able to transform like quite an unusual print into something that's very blended with my layout. I feel like I've done that on this layout with a few of the pattern papers actually. And I meant to mention it earlier. If you have ugly papers in your stash and you're looking for lots of different ways that you can use them up, I've made a video on that. I'll be sure to link it below. I'm much happier with the flow of the page now. I think it really did need those banners to stretch all the way across the page. I love the texture of them as well. See how I haven't stuck them all the way down? I've just added the stitching down the middle and then curled up the edges of each of them. It's time to add some embellishments, and I am going to keep things pretty simple for this one. There will be a main cluster there above the title, and that will stretch out towards the right, and I will balance that with a smaller cluster on the left. Essentially, they're going to be positioned in the same spots as those white banner pieces, and that's not by accident. I talk about flow a lot on the channel, I know. It's just one of those things that really helps you put your pages together. And one of the main tricks that I use is to go with the flow of what's already there. So it makes sense to build my clusters around those two highlighted banner pieces. I have a mix of embellishments happening here. There's chipboard pieces. These are black flowers are actually a puffy sticker. So I'm going to place one on the right and then one on the left, and that's going to help tie those two clusters together. I also found the perfect bow for this project. It's in that same beautiful mustard color, and I'm all about them bows. I also found some wooden buttons, and I am going to include two. I'll go with the larger size on the right-hand side cluster and then a smaller one on the left. I will very often repeat elements in my clusters. It's actually a bit of a secret hack for making your layout feel really put together. It's time to add in those smaller details. I found a very cute little butterfly and a bumblebee from this puffy sticker sheet. So So I'm going to add those. I also found these. These are like enamel stickers. They are in the shape of a button, and I'm going to use them essentially in the same way that I would use enamel dots. I'm creating a cluster of 3 on the right and then another cluster on the left. And that's going to call the layout done. I know you want to see close-up images, so here they are. You can see all the beautiful texture of the banner pieces and of course the details in the clusters. You now have a clever way to use up your ugly pattern papers, but remember those white and neutral ones. What do we do with those? Well, I'm not ready to abandon them just yet. They too deserve to be saved from the recycling, and I have hatched a plan. They are plain and they are boring. We all have white paper scraps kicking around our craft rooms, but don't throw them away just yet, because I have some genius ideas to share that will help you use them up. Ideas you may not have thought of just yet, especially number 8. Number 8's my favorite. This video is part of a paper scraps stash busting series. I've pulled out 50 different paper scraps from my stash and I'm using them up in just 5 days. And when I say all the paper scraps, I mean it. I've already used up pattern paper scraps, ugly paper scraps, and today's focus is on the most boring paper scraps. By the end of this video, you'll be able to transform the most boring papers ever. So the first idea I have for you is to create some texture, and we are going to go for a white on white look for this. I have a stack of paper strips here. Each of these is 1/2 inch wide, and I'm going to layer them up and create a weaved mat. There are lots of ways to go about this, but I have found it's much easier to create the mat on a foundation. So I actually have another white paper scrap that I'm using as my base. I began by stacking a bunch of paper strips along that left-hand edge, just one on top of each other in a stack. With those secured just on that left-hand side, I can now go about weaving in more paper strips. It's really just a matter of going underneath one strip, over the top of the next, and then under, over, all the way up to the top. Then I push the paper strip up against the previous one. And here's the point where you want to make sure that everything is nice and square. And I find it quite easy actually because you're working on the base there. It will get to a point where you'll want to secure some of this down, and you can do that. So really I'm just working from top to bottom here, sliding in each of the strips. And once I have sort of 3 or 4 in position, I'm then adding my adhesive. Your main focus here is to ensure that everything stays nice and square. Don't worry too much about the edges because I'm going to use my paper trimmer to trim those up and make those nice and neat. This is going to become a card base. I will create with that in a moment. First up though, I need to get to idea number 2. It is a super simple idea, but simple is always best. I'm going to use my basic shape punches and punch as many shapes as possible out of these smaller white scraps. These are so handy to have while you're creating, and I want to show you how you can add them to a card front. Here's how they'd look if you place them on top of the weaved mat that we just created. I have different plans for these, which is actually idea number 3. White paper scraps were made for these beautifully dimensional embossing folders. This one is from Alter New, and I'll be sure to link it along with all of the supplies I used today in the description box below. I have trimmed up the edges, and this is actually going to be another card base. The card base that the hearts are going to go onto. I'm going to keep things super simple and add the hearts in a grid formation. So I will use 9 hearts in total, and I'm going to align everything based from the center outwards. It's well worth taking a little extra time to get that center row of hearts perfect, because that's what you're going to use as a guide to add the other rows. I will need to punch out a couple of extra hearts. That's good because I still have quite a few white paper scraps here left to use. I am going to use my T-square ruler to align the bottom and top rows just to make sure everything is positioned perfectly. Here's a closer look at the beautiful texture I've created. And I'm just noticing, did I use that embossing folder backwards? I think I might have. Oh no, I'm such a professional, aren't I? Oh my gosh. Okay, moving on. This is the cardstock that I'm using. I'm going to add a pop of color with my card base. You could also just keep on with the white theme and just do a white card base. That would be beautiful for, say, a wedding card. You could also add stitching around the edge. That would be a lovely detail. I am keeping it simple though today because I've got lots more ideas to share. If you've just joined me on the challenge, welcome. I'll be sure to leave a link to the other videos in the description box below so that you can catch up. Idea number 4, and that is to make your own embellishments. White paper scraps are perfect for this, and you'll need a stamp and die set. I really love the floral ones, like this one from Pink Fresh Studio. I am going to batch create a few of these, and then I'll be able to use these on my cards and scrapbook layouts. Now, I don't want to waste the surrounding white cardstock, and that is actually idea number 5. Use your smaller pieces of white card to pre-make card sentiments. This idea is a time-saving one as well. You already have all of these supplies out, so why not stamp a few florals as well as some sentiments? I want my card to be a little bit extra today, so I am going to use embossing powder. It's time to turn on the magic and heat the powder up. And there is just something about this process that I love. It really is magical watching those little crystals of embossing powder melt away to reveal the shine of the gold. It's time now to die cut these out. Isn't that pretty? I'll use it on a card later on in the video. This is idea number 6. Did you know you can create your own swatches for inks and mixed media using up your white paper scraps? I've done this with all kinds of mixed media supplies. This one here is my Distress inks, and you can see I popped the name of the ink on the back. That one there is my watercolors, and this one here is inks from Pink Fresh Studio. On to idea number 7. Your white paper scraps are perfect to use with your electronic die cutting machines. You can match the grid on the cutting mat here to the one that's in the software of your cutting machine and really maximize those paper scraps. It's the perfect way to cut out smaller designs like these florals. And if you're ever after unique digital cut files, be sure to check the description box below. Idea number 8 is my absolute favorite, and if you have a bunch of washi tape in your stash, you're gonna love this. If any of your tapes are losing their stick, you can save them by adding them onto white paper strips. You can even save the ones that are long gone, those that are not sticky at all anymore. just glue them onto your white paper strip. You can use these on all kinds of paper craft projects, and in some ways I prefer to use them this way because you can easily audition the position of the tape. I think it's time I used that woven background piece that I created right at the start of the video. Let's make a card. I'm going to add a little bit of colour to my die cut florals here. I'm just using a blending brush and some distress ink. Super simple. I've just chosen a colour that coordinates with my washi tape strip, and I have positioned that down the left-hand side of the card. I'm going to add the sentiment at the top there and then trim off the right-hand side edge here just to get the proportions of the card right. It's looking lovely. Time to add a couple more embellishments, and I am going with these orange enamel dots. I'm going to nestle those in amongst the leaves here and just create a couple of clusters. The card front is now complete and ready to add to a card base. Here's a look at the finished card. Idea number 9 is to create project templates. This is a great way to be able to reference complicated card folds and measurements. This works on all kinds of projects and for things like this. I've actually only just gotten into these layered stencils, so I am still building up my skills with these. And when I find a colour combination that I love, I want to be able to remember it. The best way to do that is to make a template. I simply take a paper scrap and recreate the colours on that scrap. Then on the back, I record the colour names and I'll know exactly what combination I've used. Idea number 10 has certainly come about for me through necessity. I am mixed media challenged. I really struggle with these techniques, so I really need to trial and test them. I test all kinds of mixed media ideas on my white paper scraps. It's nice to know that I have the freedom to just play. At the end of day 3, I feel like we're in a pretty good place. There are still quite a few scraps left and they are getting smaller. Not to worry, I do have a little bit of magic up my sleeve. I've got an idea. A way to stretch these scraps, and I'll show you how it works for a card and a scrapbook layout. Four days ago, I was wondering what on earth I could do with all of my paper scraps. I was overwhelmed and worried that they would all end up in the recycling. That's when I decided to have a paper scraps stash busting challenge. Here are the rules. Rule number 1, a paper scrap is not a scrap unless it is less than 6 inches wide. Rule number 2, the challenge is complete when I have used 50 different paper scraps and I need to do it in just 5 days. Rule number 3, any paper scrap that is left on day 5 has to go into the recycling, no matter how pretty it is. 5 days. I'm nearing the end of the challenge and I do not want to let any of these paper scraps go, but I am running out of time. I need a way that I can add lots onto one project. I'm going to fit them together a little bit like a puzzle. This one is a twist on the idea I shared on day 1. If you've missed that video, be sure to check the description box below. I'll make a card as well because I do have quite a few smaller pieces left. I think you're going to like this idea. There is loads to share, so we best get started. Here's a look at all of the paper scraps I'll be working with today. Today's focus certainly is on getting as many scraps onto my layout as possible. I have gone ahead off camera and mounted my photo and the layout frame, and I've used this beautiful emerald green that was the perfect match for the dress that she's wearing in the picture. I can now work on a plan to get these scraps used up. I hope you're ready for a little bit of controversy. So I am actually going to use blue on this layout. I am going to pair the emerald green with blue. Did your mother ever tell you that blue and green should never be seen except with another colour in between? That's how it went, right? I think that's how it went. Well, that is definitely the plan for today because I still have quite a few blue scraps left over and it is day 4. Today's the day that I have to get a lot of scraps on this page, and that's going to mean mixing and matching colours and prints that I maybe wouldn't normally. Essentially, what I'm trying to do is create 2 rows of the paper strips. These are a little bit different to the clusters I created in day 1, specifically because the top edge is going to stay nice and straight. I very loosely want them to feel more like hanging banners than a cluster of paper scraps. You might notice that I'm fussing a little bit more with this top banner. There's a couple of reasons for that. The first one being that I need to be mindful of the printed paper that's going to go side by side with my photo. We all know that mums give the best advice, so I am going to follow what she says and avoid putting any blue up against my photo there. The other thing that I'm really paying attention to is the balance of colours and prints in the banners themselves. I want to be sure that the pops of various colours are spread quite evenly across the page. I thought it might be fun to add an extra detail to these, so I have run the base page through my sewing machine and added just a row of stitching along the tops of each of the banners. It was at this point that I decided my photo needed a second photo mat. I feel like it really helps it pop off the page and it helps with that blue flag there on the left. I wasn't too worried about it at this point because I knew that there were embellishments that I was going to place around my photo. What I didn't realise was just how perfect that one on the left would be. It's actually the perfect shape because it's quite rectangular and it does go with the flow of the photo and with the direction of the banners. For me, this is the most fun part of creating. I love to find the perfect place for each embellishment. At this point, I'm thinking a lot about the flow of the page. I do want it to read left to right, and it is a very horizontal design, so I want to be sure to add my title within that same space. I don't want it to sit too low because I know that the eye is going to naturally travel left to right across the page. This gold puffy sticker title was perfect, and in fact, this collection has a bunch of them. And I have to say, they are in the most perfect shade of gold. I'll be sure to link them below along with all of the supplies I'm using today. So this is the point where everything that I have said previously about blue and green goes out the window. I could not believe I found that floral embellishment. It's a blue flower with green leaves. It is literally made for this page. Could not believe it. Of course, I have to put it on the right there, and what it does is opens my mind to new possibilities, like this chipboard piece right here. I'm really loving the balance of the blue on the page now, and I love that I've got an element that's raised up. That piece is chipboard, so I've got a little bit more texture happening now. I wasn't crazy keen on the sentiment, not a problem. I'm just going to cover it up with that beautiful swan. You might have noticed that I do prefer to work from biggest embellishments through to smallest. Think of it a little bit like a wedding cake. The bottom tier is the biggest, and that is the base of the layout. The middle tier are medium-sized embellishments, and then the top tier and the decorations are those extra details that really pull a page together. And if you ever feel that your page is missing a little something, add a bow. They always work, which is why I'm all about them bows. If you are looking for help with building out embellishment clusters, I actually created a video series on that. I'll be sure to link it below. It's filled with ideas and tips and tricks that will work for scrapbook layouts as well as for cards. I'm finalising the last few details, and that's the layout complete. Here you can see all the details of the embellishment clusters and those really beautiful paper layers. I managed to get so many paper scraps onto this layout, and I love how it turned out. Let me show you how this idea will work for a card. Here's a look at the paper banner that I created for my card base. I've used exactly the same technique as I used on the scrapbook layout, just in a smaller scale. What I did do though was add a ribbon along the top edge there, as well as my stitching. I've cut a card front to match the card base, and then all I'm going to do is center this piece on the card. From here, you have lots of options. I'm going to keep things pretty simple and just add a sentiment using the thicker alphabets. You could keep things super simple and just leave it as is. I am going to add one more detail. This is a fussy cut out butterfly from a pattern paper. I'll attach the card front to the card base now, and that's the card complete. I love the layers of paper on this card, and I think it's a really clever way to use up your scraps. At the end of day 4, I only have tiny paper scraps to go, but there is a lot of them. Too many. Can I actually save these from the recycling? There's only one day left to find out. It is day 5 of my 5-day challenge to use up 50 different paper scraps. And I've come a long way. I've used up pattern paper scraps, ugly paper scraps, white paper scraps, and I am now left just with the teeny tiny paper scraps. Time is running out, and these may end up in the recycling because rules are rules. Rule number 3 says that any scrap left today will go into the recycling no matter how pretty it is. I plan on making around 10 cards today. I do hope this works. It's time to find out. Here's a look at all of the paper scraps that I have left. So today's the day that I need to use each and every one of them. I'm quite nervous about the number of paper strips that I have. A lot of these pieces are not only small, but they're quite skinny. So I am going to have to come up with a plan to use those. There's nowhere near enough paper to make a card base with what I have. So I am going to create 2 using cardstock from my stash. These are 10.5 inches long by 5 3/4 inches wide. Next, I need to create 4 score lines. So I am going to work from the left-hand edge. The first one is at 1 3/4 inches, and the second one is at 3.5 inches. I'll rotate the paper 90 degrees and then repeat. So 1 3/4 and then 3.5. Now, if you're lucky enough to have a full size scoreboard, you could score left to right 1 3/4, 3.5, 7 inches, and then 8 3/4. But this is how I've done it because I only have a mini one. I now need to add in a couple of cuts. So I've positioned my cardstock into my trimmer at 1.5 inches. And I'll cut between the first score line and the last score line. This is a little bit tricky, so be sure to keep your paper nice and square inside your trimmer. This is an accordion style folded cut. card. So the first fold needs to go away from you and the last fold needs to come towards you. You'll end up with a bit of a Z shape like so. For this next part, you want to actually keep this center part of the card separate from your folds. The top and the bottom parts of the card are just alternating towards you, away from you, towards you, away from you. The center part is the opposite of that. The other way that I've heard this being described is peaks and valleys. So the center part of the card is a peak and then a valley. The outside parts of the card is a peak, a valley, a peak, and then a valley. From there, you'll be able to fold the card onto itself and then be sure to burnish the edges really well. I have made 2 of these cards so you can have another quick look at what the folds should look like. This is a bit of a tricky one to describe, but you'll know you have it right when the card will stack on top of itself. It's now time to decorate and you will see why I've gone with this card design. It is perfect for using up lots of smaller paper scraps because the card has sort of sections in it that I can mount in pretty papers. The hardest part at this point was finding papers that would not only fit the square but would also coordinate well together. I'm so glad that at the beginning of the series, I was a little bit mindful of the 50 papers that I started to work with. I'm glad I took the time to find 50 that would work together really well and didn't just choose 50 random pieces of paper. I would 100% recommend doing that if you're going to give this challenge a go. To create a little bit of consistency, I am trying to replicate prints. So for this first card, I did use that deep green print on the front panel and the back panel, and then the mustard bird print in the top and bottom panels. And then I've added a contrasting pattern for this middle section here. I'm going to repeat that print on this back section here as well. And I am actually going to leave these sections plain and just have that cardstock showing through. There's a couple of reasons for that. Firstly, I need somewhere to write on my card, so I have a spot for that. But secondly, I just wanted to calm down those prints. I am still working with a bunch of busy prints here, and I just felt like it needed a little bit of empty space on the card to make it feel less busy. I'll show you those cards at the end of the video. I want to get started on card number 3. This one is perfect for all those paper strips that you have, and it's really simple to do. You will first want to work out the card size that you're going to make, so I suggest creating the card base and then making a card front to fit it perfectly. Next, take all of those paper strips that you have that are long and skinny and trim them to 3/4 of an inch wide. You're going to lay them on the card base in what might appear to be a random order, but I want you to pay attention to the balance of the colors in the prints that you're using. Try to use repeating patterns and also pay attention to where the prints join. Think of them a little bit like tiles. You won't want your join marks to line up exactly. You kind of want to stagger them. Trim the ends as you go and continue this process until the card front is fully covered. Now you might find that as you go, there's a strip at the bottom that's too skinny to cover with pattern paper. No problem, just trim it off. You'll also need to adjust your card base. So again, I've just trimmed that little section off. I wanted to add an extra detail to this one, so I have popped it into my sewing machine and stitched around the edge. Here you can see the card bases that I began the video with, so they are all lined ready for embellishments. This next card is inspired by this particular paper scrap. I think it's so pretty and I can't believe I haven't used it yet. I'll mount it onto some cardstock and then add it to this green pattern paper. That one is now ready for embellishments, which I'll show you at the end of the video. This next next idea is one of my favorites. I'm going to start by punching out a bunch of squares using my paper punch, and I have chosen patterns that will go together really nicely. You can see here too, the papers on the right, that's all that I have left to use. Maybe, just maybe, I might be able to do this. Okay, so the next thing I want to do with my squares is chop them in half. I'm actually going to make a bunch of triangles. I'll be working on another white piece of scrap from my stash, and I'm going to put together a patchwork quilt. This one, though, is not random at all. This is not like the example that I shared on day one. This is a very structured geometric quilt. Piece by piece, I'm going to add the triangles to fill out the piece of cardstock. You can see the pattern here that I'm making with the triangles, and of course I'm adding the colours in a random order. I'll show you how that one turns out later in the video. This next card is going to work in a very similar way. I've started with coordinating patterns again. This time though, I'm going to create some squares. These will each be 3/4 of an inch square. I'm going for an ombre design for this card base. So I'm starting with a very light cream coloured pattern paper on the left, and I'm going to transition that through the yellow and the deep mustard and then to the pink. Imagine them as bricks or tiles, and they're going to be stacked one on top of each other. Now there is a little bit of a knack to getting the colours to look like they're going to blend with each other, and that is to actually stagger them. So see how I've got the yellow patch there and there's gaps in between? I'm actually going to fill those gaps with the darker colour. I'm not creating straight rows of colour. I'm actually moving left to right, leaving those gaps in between so that I can blend in the darker colour. The colours do want to blend together, otherwise you'll end up with rows that look more like stripes. If you find this really tricky, what you can also do is just add the colours randomly in a similar way that we did with the triangles. The other big tip I have for you is to map it out first. If you're not sure, don't add your glue until you've trialed and tested the colours and you know exactly what's going to go where. Here's a look at the base. It's now ready for embellishing, and here's a look at what's left. Four paper scraps are left. My biggest concern is this blue floral. I'm not going to call it ugly, but it certainly isn't my favourite. I'm going to draw on one of my all-time favourite hacks for not so pretty paper, and I'm going to cover it with vellum. This piece is from deep in my stash. I want to say Maggie Holmes' open book collection, so several years old now. I will have to do a little bit of trimming here, and I am trying to make this card as large as I can, just given the scraps that I have to use. You could just leave this piece as it is, but I actually want to turn this into a sequin shaker. So I've added stitching around 3 sides, and then this top section I've left open so that I can place the sequins inside. I'll then go back and add stitching along that top edge, and that will seal everything in. I can then add this entire section onto a card base, and it will be ready for embellishing. I've spent the afternoon playing with pretty embellishments and finishing off all the cards, and I want to show you them one by one. Starting with the first 2 cards that I made, I'm actually going to leave these and hold them in my stash as they are. I want the flexibility of being able to adjust the sentiment and some of the icons on these based on the occasion that they're going to be gifted. So if it's a birthday, I think I want to do something like celebrate or even just happy here. And I'm not sure whether I'm going to use them for birthdays or as a thank you card. And the only way to have the flexibility is to just leave them as they are and then add the embellishments once I know exactly who they're going to. For this one, I knew I wanted to create a thank you card. This is the card that had just that one paper strip that inspired its creation. Super simple card, and I really like that about it. I've added some stitching around the edge there, and then a lovely simple thicker sticker. So this is all one piece. It's just a sticker that I've placed, and then I fussy cut out the butterflies. Isn't that pretty? I love the shine on this one. So, so lovely. You did not see me make this one. This one worked in a similar way to this one here, in that I had this one strip of pattern paper that I wanted to use, and I've just layered some embellishments on top. Super simple card. I made sure too for this one not to add any stitching. I know that you don't always have access to a sewing machine or have the time to create the stitches on a card. So this one is very simple, no stitching, came together in probably about 10 minutes. I want to show you this one next. I love how this turned out. This is the one with that very busy pattern paper in the background that I turned into a shaker pocket. The one thing I would change here though is I would have maybe used darker sequins. These are white and they are very subtle. You can see them probably a little bit better in person than on camera here, but I think maybe a darker blue might have been a better way to go. This card is all about the shine. I love these stamped images. So these are being stamped and then die cut and embossed with a gold embossing powder. This is just another little paper scrap that I had, some alphabets and a fussy cut butterfly. This one is going out to a special friend as a random hello. And yeah, I think it's really cute. I think it turned out really cute, especially given that I wasn't that big of a fan of that pattern paper to start with. I've left these ones till last because they've all worked on a very similar idea. So these are the ones where we've patched together paper strips. So this was the rectangular one. So there's strips of the rectangular paper scraps that have been staggered a little bit like tiles or bricks on a wall. I've then added just a simple tag, some puffy stickers, and then a sentiment. This one says "so thankful," and a bow. I'm all about them bows. I think the stitching adds a really lovely detail to this card as well. I love that. Next up we have our squares. So these are 3/4 of an inch by 3/4 of an inch, and this is the one that was the ombre sort of look to it. So starting with the light tones going through yellow and then to pink. And I have kept this very simple. Card is open this way for this one. And I've just added a rectangle panel on this end and added a sentiment. You're the best. Kiss, hug, kiss, hug. I really like the simplicity of this. I think by keeping the embellishment simple, the background stands out. And I really like this look. I actually want to try this idea on a scrapbook page. I think it would look really, really dramatic. If you're not feeling confident about the ombre print, this is what it would look like if you just applied the tiles randomly. So I did want to show you how that would look, and I really love the look of this one too. I have probably embellished it a little bit heavier than this one, but that's just how it turned out. I do like the thicker title, the fussy cut butterfly, and this one would have made a very sweet Valentine's Day card. I have 2 more cards to share with you, and then I can show you what paper scraps are left. These are the ones that I did with the triangles. So very geometric design, very balanced and linear. I've made sure that everything lines up nice and straight, and I've gone with a centered sentiment. This one says "hello, hooray," and I thought it might be fun to send for when I hear good news, maybe even a birthday, but I wanted to keep it pretty generic and pretty general so that I've got options. I do love to have these kind of cards on hand ready to send when I hear good news. This is the second one, so I've done it a little bit differently, off-centered the sentiment and the embellishing, just to see what that would look like, and love that too. This is quite dimensional, this one. This one ended up being quite dimensional, so this might have to go along with some fresh flowers and a visit. I do love the scale of these ones. I love how big they are, and I can really imagine this idea on a scrapbook layout as well. So I'm going to keep that in the back of my mind too. I was really surprised at just how many paper scraps I was able to get onto these cards, and I love how they turned out, especially these ones. I think these ideas of paper piercing are real winners. So here's what's left. 15 tiny pieces. Most of these are tab elements that really could be added onto any papercraft project. Proof that every paper scrap has potential. Rules are rules, and I knew this day would come. Their fate was decided until I found this. Even more paper scraps, and that's when I decided to just add them to these. Looks like I am going to have to do another paper scraps stash busting challenge because no scrap should be left behind. They really are like weeds in the garden, impossible to get rid of.